The punch landed after the universe had already decided it was too late. There was no flash, no thunder, no cinematic explosion to warn anyone that something irreversible had just occurred. The sky didn't crack, reality didn't scream. It simply paused, as if existence itself needed a moment to confirm what it had just allowed. Somewhere, a god realized he could bleed. Somewhere else, a man who had never measured his strength finally felt resistance, and it frightened him more than victory ever could. The contradiction is this: the strongest blow ever thrown was also the quietest. No witnesses who understood it, no cameras that could frame it, just a pressure in the air that made planets shudder a fraction out of alignment, and a silence so deep it swallowed prayers before they could form. Power is supposed to announce itself. It is supposed to dominate, to declare, to demand recognition. This power did none of that. It arrived without context, without intention, without permission. And because of that, every system built on control began to rot from the inside. Heroes felt it first, not as fear but as doubt. A strange, corrosive doubt that crept into their bones and asked a single question they had never needed to answer before: what if we were never the ceiling? Villains felt it as rage, not because they had been challenged, but because they had been rendered irrelevant. And somewhere far above the world, a man who believed himself untouchable stared into empty space and smiled too hard, too fast, as something unfamiliar curled in his chest. Not pain, not weakness. Uncertainty. The universe had always survived because power was balanced by cost, by sacrifice, by consequence. But what happens when someone arrives who did not earn their strength through suffering and therefore does not understand what it is worth? This is not a story about who wins. It is a story about what breaks when winning becomes meaningless. And it begins at the moment. One punch proved that gods were only pretending to be necessary. If you are listening, then the fracture has already reached you. Stories like this do not stay contained. They leak. They press against the walls of the mind until you feel the pressure behind your eyes and mistake it for curiosity. That is how it starts, not with belief, but with attention. You are not being asked to judge what happens next. Judgment is a luxury reserved for worlds that still have rules. This one is in the process of losing them. What follows is not a warning, though it may feel like one. It is an invitation to stand inside the moment before collapse and listen to the sound it makes, to watch certainty erode in real time, to feel what it costs when power arrives without purpose and purpose is forced to adapt. Do not look for heroes. Do not look for villains. Look for the people who realize too late that the stories they told themselves were load-bearing. If you continue, you accept the risk of seeing familiar icons stripped of the lies that kept them functional. You accept that no one leaves untouched, not even the one who threw the punch. The door is already open. All that remains is whether you step through before it closes behind you. The first people to realize something had gone wrong were not the ones trained to save the world. They were the ones trained to watch it. At 02:17 UTC, 3 independent monitoring systems, built by different nations, funded by rival interests, maintained by people who hated each other, registered the same anomaly. Not a spike, not a burst, not an attack signature anyone had prepared for. A hesitation. A fraction of a second where the atmosphere behaved as if it had been asked a question and hadn't decided how to answer yet. The algorithms corrected it instantly. Noise suppression routines kicked in. Human error margins swallowed the discrepancy whole. But the technicians noticed anyway. They always did. Because systems that agree by accident once never do it again. Within minutes, internal flags were raised, then quietly downgraded. The event didn't fit any escalation ladder. There was no protocol for something happened but nothing broke. And that was the problem. Across the world, people felt it in ways they would later struggle to describe. A tightening in the chest, a moment of vertigo, the sensation that the floor beneath reality had shifted half an inch to the left and then politely pretended it hadn't. In a Manhattan tower built from glass, steel, and belief, a man stood alone and stared at his reflection. He had just finished smiling. That realization came to him late, like noticing blood on your hands after the fight is already over. The smile had not been for anyone else. No cameras were active. No audience waited. It had surfaced on its own, uninvited, the reflex of someone accustomed to being admired even in solitude. But as he stared into the glass, the expression unraveled. Not into fear, into irritation. The reflection looked wrong, not weak, not damaged, just insufficient, as if it had failed to confirm something it was supposed to guarantee. He leaned closer, eyes narrowing, searching his own face for answers he did not like admitting he wanted. For a single, impossible instant, he had felt pressure. Not physical, not emotional. Existential. As if the world had briefly stopped orienting itself around him. He straightened sharply, jaw tightening. "No," he said aloud, voice low, controlled. The word echoed slightly in the empty room. "That's not possible." He turned away, dismissing the thought with practiced ease. Fatigue. Static. A meaningless flicker of irritation caused by too many responsibilities and not enough reverence. The world did not challenge him. The world never had. Thousands of miles away, on a stretch of forgotten coastline no satellite prioritized, a man in a yellow tracksuit stared at his right hand. The ocean in front of him was unnaturally calm, not peaceful, suspended. He flexed his fingers slowly, as if expecting resistance that never came. The punch had been stupid. That was the word he kept coming back to. Stupid. There had been no enemy, no monster, no threat to justify the movement, just boredom, frustration, that familiar itch under the skin that came from living in a world that offered nothing capable of pushing back. He hadn't even been angry. He just wanted to feel something. When his fist cut upward through the air, the world had answered. Not with pain, not with recoil. With acknowledgement. The space around his knuckles had compressed, thickening for an instant, like the atmosphere itself had stiffened in surprise before deciding to move out of the way. The sensation had passed so quickly, he almost convinced himself he imagined it. Almost. He lowered his arm now, staring at it as if it belonged to someone else. That was new, he muttered. The silence after the punch hadn't felt empty. It felt alert, as if the environment itself was waiting for instructions it had never needed before. That unsettled him more than any explosion ever could have. In command centers buried beneath cities, people who trusted data more than intuition began to sweat. Briefings were called without agendas. Simulations were run without parameters. Eyes lingered on maps that showed nothing wrong and therefore everything wrong. "We're not seeing a threat," one analyst said carefully. "No," the woman at the head of the table replied. "We're seeing a blind spot." She studied the rotating projection of the planet, her expression unreadable. Blind spots get people killed. Back in the tower, the man everyone called a god stood before a bank of screens and watched the world reassure itself. Markets stabilized, news cycles corrected, social feeds filled with arguments about nothing important. The planet spun, order held. He should have felt satisfied. Instead, his fingers curled slowly into a fist. He turned screens off one by one, until only the city remained, tiny, obedient, glittering below him. For the first time in years, the height felt insufficient. On the shore, the man in the tracksuit skipped a stone across the water. It bounced, sank, disappeared. Normal. He exhaled, trying to convince himself that was all this was. A fluke. a sensation without meaning. Then a seagull landed nearby. It stared at him. He stared back. The air thickened. The bird shrieked and fled, wings beating hard, vanishing into the sky as if chased by something invisible. He hadn't moved. He swallowed. "Okay," he said quietly, "that's not normal." Understanding crept in slowly, unwelcome and heavy. This wasn't a moment. It was a threshold. Whatever line he had crossed, the world now knew he existed. And somewhere far above the city, a man who had never doubted his place in the hierarchy felt a cold thought form for the first time. If something can act without needing me. He crushed the thought before it could finish. But it left a crack behind. The silence shifted again. This time it leaned closer. The silence did not spread like a shockwave. It spread like a rumor. Not loud enough to panic, not clear enough to confront, just present enough to make people hesitate before speaking, before acting, before assuming they understood the shape of the world they woke up in. By mid-morning, the first quiet adjustments had already begun. Security teams were told to double-check systems that had never failed. Analysts were asked to rerun models that had been considered settled science. Somewhere deep inside a building no one remembered approving, a red folder was removed from a shelf and placed gently on a table, as if sudden movements might offend whatever had made it necessary again. No one said the word threat. They said anomaly. They said outlier. They said context pending. But every person in the room understood the same unspoken truth. Control only exists as long as the unknown stays hypothetical. In the tower, the man at the top felt the day stretch uncomfortably long. Meetings blurred together. Voices became noise. Compliments landed wrong, like applause arriving half a beat too late. He found himself interrupting people, not out of impatience, but because listening felt intolerable. Every second spent receiving information was a second spent not acting. And he needed to act. He dismissed his final handler before noon and walked alone through corridors designed to feel like reverence. Polished floors, stark lines, architecture that reminded everyone inside it who they served. He stopped before a reinforced observation window and stared out over the city again. Normally, the view steadied him. The scale, the submission of millions of lives moving in patterns that made sense, order maintained by the understanding that he was watching. Today the city looked indifferent. Not rebellious, not hostile. Just busy. He pressed his palm against the glass. It did not crack. It never did. Still, the gesture felt performative. "You don't get to change," he said softly to no one, "not without me." The words echoed back wrong. Elsewhere, on a train platform that smelled of oil and rain, the man in the tracksuit stood among commuters and tried to disappear. He hated crowds, not because they scared him, but because they made everything fragile. Too many things he could break by accident. Too many lives balanced on the assumption that he would keep pretending to be normal. Today, pretending felt harder. He could feel it now even here, the pressure, faint but persistent, like a low-frequency hum beneath reality. Not centered on him exactly, but responding to him. As if the space around his body had learned a new rule and was still adjusting. A woman brushed past him and apologized without looking up. "Sorry," she said, distracted. He nodded automatically, heart thudding. She hadn't noticed anything. Good. But the relief didn't last. As the train approached, the air along the platform rippled subtly, not enough to be seen, enough to be felt. A few people frowned. Someone rubbed their arms against a sudden chill. The man clenched his fists inside his pockets and forced himself to breathe slowly. "Easy," he muttered under his breath. "Just don't." The pressure receded. The train arrived. He stepped aboard, shoulders hunched, surrounded by ordinary lives that did not deserve whatever he might accidentally become. Across the globe, cameras watched skis that did not change. Satellites recalibrated, sensors adjusted thresholds, 1,000 invisible systems strained to close a gap they could not define. In one secure facility, the woman who trusted systems less than most stared at a wall of data and felt the first stirrings of anger. "This thing," she said quietly, "doesn't announce itself. It doesn't escalate. It doesn't repeat." "What does that mean?" someone asked. "It means it's not testing us," she replied. "It already knows it doesn't have to." That night, the man from the tower flew. Not for a mission, not for show. For confirmation. He rose into the upper atmosphere, leaving sound and civilization behind, and hovered where the curve of the planet became visible. Up here, the world usually felt small, manageable, fragile in a way that reassured him. He extended his senses outward, searching for resistance, for challenge, for anything that justified the irritation gnawing at him all day. He found nothing. Stars burned, radiation whispered, physics behaved. And yet, something was missing. Not an object, not a presence. A certainty. He descended abruptly, jaw tight, speed tearing clouds apart beneath him. On the train, the man in the tracksuit stepped off at his stop and exhaled shakily as the doors closed behind him. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from restraint. He walked home slowly, counting his steps, grounding himself in the mundane. The sound of traffic, the smell of food from open windows, life proceeding as if nothing had changed. Inside his apartment, he sat on the floor and stared at the wall. "I didn't ask for this," he said again, louder now, as if repetition might make it true. The wall did not answer, but the pressure lingered. High above the city, the man who believed himself necessary stood in shadow and felt something he could no longer ignore. Not fear. Competition. He didn't know where it was. He didn't know what it wanted. But for the first time in his life, the top of the world felt crowded. And somewhere between restraint and reaction, between denial and obsession, the balance shifted just enough to matter. The silence had learned a new shape, and it was beginning to choose sides. Attention arrived before understanding ever could. It crept in through screens and whispers, through the subtle recalibration of priorities that happened when powerful people stopped pretending everything was fine. No announcement marked its arrival, no alarm sounded, but suddenly, resources were being redirected, conversations were being rerouted, old favors were being called in by people who did not like admitting they were nervous. The world was not panicking. It was focusing. In the tower, the man at the top watched the shift happen in real time. He could feel it in the way briefings changed tone, less certainty, more contingency. His name still commanded rooms, still bent outcomes, but there was a new hesitation now, almost imperceptible, as if people were listening for something else in the silence after he spoke. He hated that silence. He began inserting himself where he normally wouldn't, appearing unannounced, ending meetings early, making decisions that didn't need to be made yet, just to remind everyone that motion still originated with him. Control, after all, was a performance, and performances required an audience. But late that night, alone again, he found himself replaying the same question over and over, unable to smother it with noise. What if attention isn't loyalty? The thought made his jaw tighten. Across the city, deep in a building designed to survive the end of the world, the woman who trusted systems less than people studied a new pattern emerging from the data. Not a location, not a signal. A response. "Every time we narrow the model," she said to the room, "the anomaly doesn't resist, it adapts." "That suggests intelligence," someone said carefully. She shook her head. "No, intelligence implies intent, This feels more like inevitability. The word hung heavy. On a cracked sidewalk under flickering streetlights, the man in the tracksuit stopped walking. He'd been trying to exhaust himself. Long strides, tight breathing, a rhythm that usually shut his thoughts down. It wasn't working. The pressure followed him now, not constant but patient, like a tide that only surged when he wasn't paying attention. He could feel it swell when his focus drifted, when his emotions spiked. When he considered using his strength. A car backfired nearby. He flinched instinctively. The air thickened. A lamppost groaned, metal bending, with a scream that made him spin around in horror. "Stop," he whispered urgently. "Stop, stop." He forced himself to relax, unclenching muscles he hadn't realized were tense. The pressure faded. The lamppost settled, warped but standing. His heart pounded. This wasn't power. This was liability. He leaned against a brick wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the ground, head in his hands. "I can't do this," he said quietly. "I can't even think without breaking something." Miles above him, the man in the tower stared at a projection of the globe and felt something twist unpleasantly in his chest. The anomaly was still undefined, which meant it could be anywhere. And anything that could exist outside his awareness represented a failure he could not tolerate. "Find it," he ordered, voice cold. "I don't care how." "But we don't know what it is," a handler replied cautiously. His eyes snapped toward them. "Then find what doesn't belong," he said. "I want the absence, I want the gap." Silence followed. Not reverent this time. Uneasy. Across the world, lines were being drawn, not on maps but in minds, between faith and doubt, between comfort and vigilance, between those who believed the world was still governed by familiar rules and those who sensed the rules were in the process of being rewritten. The man in the tracksuit finally stood and continued walking, slower now, deliberate. He didn't look up at the sky. He was afraid of what might answer if he did. And in the tower, the man who had always been watched realized something that made his breath hitch. For the first time, he wasn't sure whether attention was moving toward him or away. Attention, once focused, does not stay neutral. It sharpens. It asks questions. And when answers do not arrive, it invents its own. By the third day, the absence had become a presence. News outlets began circling the same non-event from different angles, each convinced they were the first to notice something that could not be pointed to directly. Experts were invited on air to explain fluctuations that didn't exist. Panels debated hypothetical scenarios with rehearsed urgency, building tension out of negative space. The public didn't know what they were afraid of, but they could feel permission being withdrawn. In the tower, the man everyone trusted to be inevitable felt the shift most acutely. Adoration was still there. He could summon it at will, walk into any room, appear on any screen, and bend the emotional temperature of the planet around himself. But now it felt thinner, like applause echoing in a larger room. He stood before a mirror again, studying the details of his face with surgical intensity. The confidence was still perfect, the posture flawless, the body unchanged. Yet something essential was missing. Certainty used to live behind his eyes. Now there was only insistence. He turned away sharply, irritation flaring into something hotter. If the world needed reassurance, he would give it reassurance. If it needed a reminder, he would remind it. Elsewhere, far from glass and steel, the man in the tracksuit sat at a small kitchen table and stared at a cracked mug cooling between his hands. He hadn't slept. Every time his thoughts wandered, the pressure responded, subtle, intimate, invasive, like reality itself had learned his tells, his moods, his impulses. He realized with a sinking weight that this wasn't just strength reacting to emotion. It was emotion amplified into consequence. A knock at the door made him jolt. He froze, heart racing, listening. Another knock, firmer. He stood slowly, every movement deliberate, and opened the door a fraction. A neighbor stood there, holding a package. "Delivery guy left this with me," she said with a polite smile. "You weren't answering." He took the box carefully, as if it might explode. "Thanks," he said. She hesitated, eyes flicking over him. "You okay?" she asked. "You look tired." He forced a smile. "Yeah, just work." She nodded, unconvinced, and walked away. He closed the door and leaned against it, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor again. Even that had been close. Across the world, the woman who trusted systems watched as the last of her models failed quietly. Not catastrophically. Elegantly. Each simulation adjusted itself just enough to avoid collapse, bending assumptions without breaking them. The anomaly refused to be pinned down, not because it was evasive, but because it did not operate on the same axis as the systems trying to measure it. "It's not hostile," she said finally, exhaustion edging her voice. "And that's worse." "Why?" someone asked. "Because hostility would give us motive," she replied. "This doesn't care." In the tower, the man at the top made a decision. He would remind the world what certainty looked like. He descended into the city with controlled force, making sure the cameras were already rolling when he arrived. A staged crisis. A familiar threat. Something dramatic enough to recalibrate attention back where it belonged. The intervention was flawless. Efficient, dominant, visually undeniable. The crowd cheered, the feeds lit up, the narrative snapped back into place. For a moment, relief washed through him. Then it curdled. Because beneath the noise, beneath the praise, he felt it again. That subtle resistance. Not opposition. Indifference. As if something somewhere had watched the display and found it unnecessary. On his apartment floor, the man in the tracksuit felt the pressure spike, sharp, sudden, disorienting. He gasped, clutching his chest as the walls around him creaked in protest. "No," he whispered. "No, what are you doing?" He focused, grounding himself, forcing the sensation down. The pressure receded. He sat there shaking, understanding finally locking into place. Someone else had just used power. And the world had responded. Not to them. To him. Far above the city, the man who believed himself the axis of all things hovered in silence and felt a truth he could no longer deny. Whatever this was, it was not impressed. And worse, it was beginning to react. The first mistake was assuming escalation required intent. People were used to threats announcing themselves, to enemies revealing desire, ambition, grievance. Escalation in their minds was always a decision, someone choosing to push harder, strike louder, cross a line with purpose. This was different. This was consequence, moving faster than comprehension. By the end of the week, the world had developed a nervous system, not official, not centralized, a web of instincts, alerts, rumors, and overcorrections that reacted to potential rather than fact. Flights were rerouted for reasons no one could justify after the paperwork was filed. Military exercises overlapped unintentionally, each side mistaking the other's caution for provocation. The planet wasn't at war. It was bracing. In the tower, the man who had once defined certainty began to feel surrounded by it. Every victory felt smaller than the one before. Every display of power required more spectacle to achieve the same effect. He found himself lingering in the aftermath of his own interventions, searching faces for the old awe. He still found it. But now it shared space with something else. Calculation. People were no longer just watching him. They were measuring. That realization ate at him in quiet moments, in the pauses between applause, in the way conversations resumed faster after he left a room, as if his presence no longer defined the tempo. He responded the only way he knew how. With escalation. Not reckless, not uncontrolled. Strategic. He pushed further into the upper limits of what he was willing to demonstrate. Faster responses, greater force, cleaner dominance. He wanted the world to remember the comfort of inevitability. But inevitability, once questioned, becomes just another claim. Across the city, buried in routine and exhaustion, the man in the tracksuit reached his own breaking point. It happened in a grocery store aisle. He stood staring at a shelf of cereal, unable to remember why he'd come. His thoughts felt foggy, slippery. Every attempt to focus triggered that familiar pressure, subtle but insistent, like a hand resting between his shoulder blades. A child nearby began to cry. The sound pierced him. Sharp, emotional, uncontrolled. The pressure surged. Cans rattled on shelves, glass shuddered, the air vibrated with a low, threatening hum. People looked around in confusion. He panicked. "No, no, no," he whispered, squeezing his eyes shut, forcing himself to breathe through the rising chaos. He thought of nothing. Absolutely nothing. The pressure collapsed inward, snapping back so suddenly he nearly fell. Silence followed. The child stopped crying, startled into stillness. Shoppers exchanged nervous glances, laughing awkwardly, already rationalizing what they'd felt as imagination. The man abandoned his cart and walked out into the daylight, legs shaking. He didn't stop walking until he reached a park and collapsed onto a bench, head bowed. "I can't stay here," he said to himself. "I can't be around people." The realization hurt more than fear. For the first time, his strength wasn't isolating him because others were fragile. It was isolating him because he was. Elsewhere, the woman who trusted systems watched escalation unfold without a single hostile act to point at. "This is the danger," she said to the small group she'd stopped briefing officially days ago. "Everyone is reacting to everyone else's reactions." "Feedback loop," someone murmured. She nodded without a source. A junior analyst hesitated, then spoke. "What if the source isn't escalating?" he asked. "What if it's just present?" The room fell quiet. In the tower, the man who refused to be secondary made another choice. He would confront the unknown. Not directly, not blindly, but symbolically. He announced a global address. Not emergency, not warning, a reassurance speech, carefully worded, perfectly timed, broadcast everywhere that mattered. He spoke of stability, of guardianship, of the unchanging nature of the world's protectors. He spoke like someone laying claim. As he delivered the final lines, something unexpected happened. He felt it. Not pressure. Orientation. Like a compass needle, inside his chest had shifted. He paused, just for a fraction of a second, long enough for cameras to catch it, short enough that no one could quite say what they'd seen. But the world noticed. On a quiet rooftop, the man in the tracksuit looked up sharply as the pressure surged again, stronger than ever before. He staggered, gripping the railing as the air around him thickened, condensing into something almost tangible. "What did you do?" he whispered, though he didn't know who he was asking. For the first time, the pressure did not recede when he tried to calm himself. It lingered. Heavy. Demanding. Not angry. Expectant. He felt it then, the line he'd sensed days ago, now unmistakable. Someone else had stepped closer to it. Not to cross. To claim it. And the world was reacting. High above the planet, the man who had always believed himself alone at the top finished his speech and smiled for the cameras. The applause was thunderous. But beneath it, beneath the noise and celebration, something fundamental shifted. The silence did not retreat. It tightened, and for the first time, both men felt the same truth settle into their bones at once. This was no longer about restraint, or reassurance, or control. This was about collision. And the world, unprepared and already straining, had just been placed directly between them. Collision did not arrive as impact. It arrived as convergence. The world felt it before either of them understood what it meant. Time seemed to lose its edges. Cause and effect began to blur, not because reality was breaking, but because it was being forced to reconcile two incompatible assumptions at once. That there was a ceiling, and that it had already been passed. In the tower, the man everyone called a savior stood perfectly still after the broadcast ended. The lights dimmed automatically. The handlers waited for instruction that did not come. He could feel it now, clearly, unmistakably. Orientation. Not fear, not pressure. Direction. Something in the universe had shifted its frame of reference, and for the first time in his life, he was not at the center of it. "Leave," he said quietly. The room cleared in seconds. Alone, he closed his eyes and listened. He had always trusted his instincts. They had guided him through every crisis, every threat, every attempt to undermine his authority. They had never failed him. Now they were conflicted. One part of him screamed to act, to dominate, to strike preemptively at whatever dared exist outside his gravity. Another part, smaller, quieter, unfamiliar, hesitated. Not because of risk, because of uncertainty. On the rooftop, the man in the tracksuit dropped to one knee as the pressure finally pushed past discomfort and into something else entirely. Connection. The air around him didn't just thicken, it aligned, like invisible vectors snapping into place, all pointing toward him, not accusing, not hostile, but aware. He could feel the world listening. His breath came in short bursts. "No," he said through clenched teeth, "I don't want this." The pressure responded. Not by retreating, by stabilizing. That frightened him more than escalation ever could have. This wasn't a surge he could calm down from. This was a state. Across the globe, systems failed for the first time, not dramatically, but decisively. A satellite dropped signal for exactly 3 seconds before correcting itself. Power grids fluctuated within safe margins that nonetheless triggered alarms. Seismic sensors recorded a global microtremor with no epicenter. Every system agreed on one thing. Something had synchronized. The woman who trusted systems stared at the readouts and felt a chill crawl up her spine. "This isn't a spike," she said. "It's alignment." "With what?" someone asked. She didn't answer, because she already knew. Back in the tower, the man opened his eyes and made his choice. If the world was reorienting, then he would define the axis. He launched upward again, faster this time, ripping through cloud cover and into the upper atmosphere with a violence he did not bother to conceal. Shockwaves rolled outward, visible from the ground, dramatic enough to dominate every feed on the planet. Let them watch. Let them remember. He pushed higher, testing limits he'd never needed to test before. Radiation battered him. Vacuum embraced him. Space offered no resistance. And yet, something pushed back. Not force. Context. A sense of boundary that had not existed before. He snarled, accelerating harder, refusing to acknowledge the resistance for what it was. On the rooftop, the man in the tracksuit screamed. Not in rage. In overload. The pressure spiked catastrophically, the alignment snapping taut like a cable pulled too tight. Windows shattered across the block. Steel screamed. The ground cracked beneath his feet as gravity warped for a heartbeat and then reasserted itself violently. He collapsed, palms pressed to the concrete, gasping. "I can't," he choked. "I can't hold this." The pressure didn't care. It wasn't cruel. It was indifferent. High above the planet, the man who believed himself unstoppable felt it too, the same surge, the same pull. For the first time, he wasn't pushing against the universe. He was being pulled into it. He stopped abruptly, hovering in the void, chest heaving. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a rival trying to overthrow him. This was a recalibration happening through him. And somewhere below, someone else was at the other end of the same equation. Their eyes did not meet. They didn't need to. The connection locked. The world held its breath. Between them, invisible and absolute, the line finally snapped into focus. Not a battlefield. Not a destination. A threshold. And both of them now understood the same terrifying truth. The next step, whoever took it, would not just change the balance of power. It would define what power meant from that moment on. The world waited. And for the first time, waiting itself felt dangerous. The world did not survive the realization intact. It endured it. There is a difference. Survival implies resilience, an ability to absorb shock and return to form. Endurance is quieter, heavier. It is what happens when something realizes it cannot go back to what it was and chooses instead to keep going anyway. By the time the aftershock settled, nothing looked broken. That frightened people more than catastrophe ever could. Markets reopened. Flights resumed. Governments issued statements filled with confident words that carefully avoided specific claims. Faith was maintained through repetition alone. But underneath it all, something had been lost. The assumption that power was understood. In the tower, the man who had once defined the ceiling stood before an empty room and felt it collapse inward. He had felt resistance before, heroes testing him, enemies daring him, crowds wavering when his image faltered. Those had been problems with solutions, challenges that could be met with greater force, better optics, tighter control. This was not resistance. This was irrelevance encroaching. He could still level cities if he chose, still bend armies into silence, still tear the sky open just to remind the world what awe looked like. And yet, none of it felt decisive anymore. The thought scraped at him, raw and relentless. If my power requires demonstration to matter, then what happens when demonstration isn't enough? He clenched his fists, the air around them rippling instinctively, and forced himself to stillness. Control had always been his greatest weapon. He would not abandon it now. Across the city, in a building that smelled faintly of antiseptic and fear, the woman who trusted systems watched her final safeguards quietly expire. Not explode. Expire. Protocols designed to trigger under extreme conditions failed to activate, not because the conditions weren't met, but because the parameters no longer applied. The world was behaving within acceptable margins while becoming something else entirely. She removed her glasses and pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose. "We can't respond to this," she said to no one in particular. "Not with force, not with deterrence." Someone asked the obvious question. "Then what do we do?" She looked up, eyes tired but clear. "We observe," she said, "and we stop pretending we're in control." The silence that followed was not agreement. It was surrender. On the rooftop where everything had begun to spiral, the man in the tracksuit lay flat on his back, staring at the sky. He hadn't moved in hours. Not because he couldn't, but because he was afraid of what movement might trigger. The pressure was still there, no longer surging, no longer threatening to tear the world apart. It was worse. It was stable. Like gravity. Like a constant reminder that the line he had crossed could not be uncrossed. He raised one hand slowly, watching the air around it distort, subtle and obedient. "Stop," he whispered. Nothing happened. Not because the power disobeyed, but because it didn't understand the command. He let his arm fall back against the concrete. "I never wanted this," he said, voice hoarse. "I just wanted it to end." Boredom, futility, the endless parade of threats that collapsed the moment he arrived. He wanted meaning, resistance, something that told him his existence had weight. The universe had answered too literally. High above, hovering where the sky thinned into black, the other man watched the planet and made his own calculation. This thing, this someone, was not a challenger in the traditional sense. No ideology, no demands, no attempt to seize narrative or territory. That made him dangerous. Not because he wanted control, but because he didn't need it. The realization curdled into something darker. If the world could orient itself around someone who did not seek authority, then authority itself was optional. And nothing terrified him more than that. He descended slowly this time, deliberately, choosing visibility over speed. Cameras caught him cutting through the clouds like a promise returning home. The world looked up. Relief rippled outward, fragile and desperate. On the rooftop, the man in the tracksuit felt the pressure shift. Not spike. Turn. Like a shadow changing direction. He sat up sharply, heart pounding. "No," he said, "don't." But he already knew. The other one had noticed him. Not as a rumor. Not as an anomaly. As a reference point. Somewhere between the tower and the rooftop, between dominance and indifference, a decision was forming. Not spoken. Not announced. But inevitable. One of them would act. Not to win, but to define the world that came after. And whatever that action was, someone somewhere was not going to survive it unchanged. When action finally came, it did not arrive as violence. It arrived as certainty. The man from the tower did not announce his approach. He didn't need to. The world felt him before it saw him. The subtle shift in pressure, the way attention snapped back into old habits, the instinctive relief that came from believing someone was once again in charge. He landed 2 blocks from the rooftop. Not because he couldn't land closer. Because distance still mattered to him. Crowds gathered immediately, phones raised, voices overlapping in a familiar chorus of awe and reassurance. The scene reassembled itself around him effortlessly. Cameras loved him again. Reality remembered its cues. He smiled. Not the reflexive smile from before. A deliberate one. On the rooftop, the man in the tracksuit felt the smile like a change in weather. The pressure around him tightened, not aggressively but with direction, like a current shifting beneath still water. He stood slowly. His legs felt heavy, not weak, anchored, as if the world had decided he should remain exactly where he was. "Don't do this," he said quietly, though the words were no longer aimed at himself. He stepped forward anyway. The moment his foot left the rooftop, something remarkable happened. Nothing stopped him. No force, no barrier, no resistance. The city below didn't buckle, gravity didn't rebel, reality didn't scream. It simply accommodated. He landed on the street between them with a soft crack of concrete and looked up. They stood facing each other for the first time. No explosion marked the moment. No thunder. Just silence. The crowd sensed it instinctively. Voices died. Phones lowered. Something in the air demanded stillness, and for once, humanity obeyed without understanding why. The man from the tower studied him carefully. No costume, no insignia, no posture of dominance, just a man who looked tired in a way power usually erased. "This is you," he said, voice calm, carrying without effort. "You're what everyone's been feeling." The man in the tracksuit swallowed. "I didn't mean to be," he replied. The answer caught the other man off guard. Not because it was weak. Because it was honest. "You don't get to decide that," the man from the tower said, stepping closer. "Not anymore." With each step, the world leaned toward him. The pressure followed, not resisting the newcomer but reacting to the shift in intent. The man in the tracksuit felt it immediately. The alignment strained. "Stop," he said again, louder now. "You don't understand what you're doing." A flicker of irritation crossed the other man's face. "I understand power," he said. "I understand responsibility, and I understand what happens when someone like you exists without oversight." Oversight. The word landed like an accusation. "I never asked for this," the man in the tracksuit said. "I just wanted things to stop breaking when I touched them." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The man from the tower didn't look away from him. "And now they break when you think," he said. "That's worse." He raised a hand, not in attack but in demonstration. The air trembled. The crowd gasped as the streetlights bent, metal whining under invisible stress. Windows vibrated. The familiar spectacle returned, comforting in its predictability. Power displayed. "See," he continued, "this is control, this is restraint, this is what keeps the world intact." The man in the tracksuit felt the pressure spike violently. Not from the display. From the claim. "No," he said sharply. The word carried weight. The streetlights snapped back into place instantly. The air stilled. The tremor vanished as if it had never happened. A stunned silence followed. The man from the tower froze, hand still raised. For the first time, something had undone his action without effort. Not countered. Invalidated. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't scream. They stared. "What did you do?" the man from the tower demanded, voice tight. The man in the tracksuit looked down at his own hands, horrified. "I didn't," he began, then stopped. Because the truth had finally crystallized. He wasn't exerting force. He was resolving contradiction. "I'm not fighting you," he said slowly. "I'm correcting things." The word correction hung in the air, heavy and wrong. The man from the tower felt something inside him fracture. Correction implied error. And he had never been wrong. "You think you get to define that," he snapped. "You think the world bends itself around you just because you don't want anything." The pressure surged violently between them, snapping taut like a cable pulled to its limit. The ground cracked in a widening circle. Buildings groaned. The man in the tracksuit cried out, dropping to one knee as the alignment screamed under the strain. "I told you to stop," he shouted. "You're making it worse." The woman who trusted systems watched the feed from a darkened room and felt her breath leave her lungs. "This isn't a fight," she whispered. "It's a failure state." On the street, the man from the tower hesitated. Just for a moment. In that moment he saw it. Not power. Cost. The strain etched into the other man's face. The way the world itself seemed to be pressing inward, not outward. This wasn't domination. It was burden. And something inside him recoiled from that realization. He lowered his hand slowly. The pressure eased instantly. The cracks in the street stopped spreading. The air relaxed as if grateful. The man in the tracksuit collapsed forward, catching himself on trembling hands. Silence rushed back in, thick and stunned. The crowd didn't know what they had witnessed. But they knew something had changed. The man from the tower took a step back. Not in defeat. In recalculation. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You don't get to exist outside the system." The man in the tracksuit looked up at him, eyes hollow. "I am the system now," he said. The words terrified him as much as they did everyone else. Because he didn't know how to turn them off. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The world was moving again. But the balance they had just touched, that fragile, dangerous equilibrium, had been exposed. And once seen, it could never be unseen. After the confrontation, the world tried to remember how to lie to itself. It wasn't difficult at first. Humanity had centuries of practice. Explanations were issued, footage was edited, language softened sharp edges until what remained felt survivable. A localized disturbance, a misinterpreted event, a reminder that everything was still under control. The words worked briefly. But lies only hold when the people telling them believe they are necessary. Something had been revealed in that street, not power, not weakness. A truth about hierarchy. And truth, once seen, does not retreat quietly. The man from the tower returned to his sky with cameras in tow, not because he wanted them, but because he could not afford their absence. He flew slower than usual, deliberate, composed, performing stability with every measured movement. The feeds followed him like a flock seeking reassurance in formation. He landed high above the city and stood still, letting the wind press against him. Up here, he could almost pretend nothing had changed. Almost. The problem was not that he had been challenged. The problem was that the challenge had not looked like defiance. It had looked like correction. He replayed the moment over and over in his mind, not the snapping streetlights, not the stunned crowd, but the instant his power had simply ended, not overpowered, not absorbed. Resolved, as if it had never been required. The thought made his chest tight in a way no enemy ever had. For the first time, the world did not need him to act. It needed him to stop. And he did not know who he was without motion. Below, the man in the tracksuit vanished. Not dramatically, no chase, no explosion. He simply walked away while everyone else was busy processing what they had just survived, down an alley, through a service door, into the gaps between attention where ordinary people were allowed to exist. The pressure followed him like a shadow. Not hostile, persistent. He reached a derelict building near the edge of the city and sat on the floor, back against peeling concrete, breath shallow. "I didn't want that," he whispered to the empty room. "I didn't want any of that." The pressure didn't respond. It never did. That was the cruelest part. Power that argued could be reasoned with. Power that reacted could be soothed. This simply was. He raised his hand and felt the world lean subtly in response. He lowered it again, heart pounding. "I can't stay," he said aloud, as if saying it made it true. "I can't be here." Because here meant people. And people meant stakes he could no longer afford to endanger. Across the globe, the woman who trusted systems watched something far more dangerous than failure take root. Narratives were splitting. Some people clung harder to the familiar icon in the sky, defending him not because he had been right, but because he had always been there, certainty masquerading as loyalty. Others fixated on the nameless man who had undone a god without trying, not as a hero, as a possibility. Hope without structure, fear without direction. Both were volatile. "What happens now?" someone asked her quietly. She didn't answer immediately. Because for the first time in her career, the models weren't lagging behind reality. They were refusing to run. "We're past response," she said finally. "We're in aftermath." High above the city, the man from the tower clenched his fists and felt the familiar surge of strength coil obediently inside him. It was still there, unquestionably, but it felt performative now, like a crown worn after the throne had been removed. He could sense the other one, not location, not presence, but implication, a constant, low-level awareness that the world had learned a new option, one it had never been allowed to consider before. He turned toward the horizon, jaw tight. "You don't get to define this," he said quietly, "not alone." And for the first time, the statement felt like a plea disguised as a threat. In the derelict building, the man in the tracksuit stood and made his decision. Not a grand one. Not a noble one. A necessary one. If the world reacted to him simply by existing, then he would exist somewhere it could not reach so easily. He stepped forward, and the space in front of him folded. Not violently. Not spectacularly. Like a door realizing it had always been open. The pressure shifted, deepened, settled into something heavier than alignment. Responsibility. Elsewhere, high above the clouds, the man who had always been inevitable felt something change. Not resistance. Distance. He froze midair, eyes narrowing. "No," he said softly. Below, the world continued spinning, pretending nothing irreversible had just occurred. But somewhere beyond sight, beyond cameras, beyond language, the system had just moved. And neither of them knew what it would cost to follow. Distance did not feel like absence. It felt like imbalance. The man in the sky sensed it immediately, not as loss but as misalignment, like a familiar weight removed from one side of the scale, leaving everything else subtly wrong. The air around him still answered. Physics still deferred. The world still recognized his authority. But something essential was no longer reacting. He searched instinctively, senses expanding outward, brushing against layers of atmosphere, magnetosphere, the fragile shell of civilization below. Nothing. No echo. No pressure pushing back. Just a quiet where something important used to be. His breath slowed. That had never happened before. "Find him," he said, voice steady, already broadcasting orders into systems designed to obey without question. Everywhere, all at once. Satellites shifted, sensors recalibrated, networks surged with renewed purpose. They found nothing. Not because he was hiding. Because the space he had stepped into was no longer indexed. In the place beyond places, the man in the tracksuit stood very still. There was no darkness here, no light either, just a vast neutral expanse that felt unfinished, like the world before a decision had been made about what it should become. The pressure was everywhere now, not pressing, not urging, simply present. He could feel everything. Not details, not information. Potential. Each thought tugged at the fabric around him, threatening to solidify into consequence. He understood then, with a clarity that made his chest ache, why the world had begun to bend around him. This wasn't power meant to be wielded. It was power meant to end things. Not lives. Processes. Cycles. The endless escalation that required gods and monsters to justify themselves through damage. He swallowed hard. "I don't want to break it," he said into the quiet. "I just wanted to stop hurting people." The space did not answer. But it listened. Back above the world, the man who had always been necessary felt something else creeping in now. Irreversibility. For the first time, there was a future he could not dominate simply by arriving in it, a path he could not fly fast enough to cut off. The realization ignited something raw and volatile behind his eyes. If he could not control the system, then he would define the threat. He turned back toward the planet, posture rigid, expression composed into something the cameras would read as resolve. "Prepare a contingency," he ordered, "global." His handlers hesitated. "For what?" one asked carefully. He didn't look at them. "For the possibility," he said, "that the world has mistaken silence for mercy." In the space beyond, the man in the tracksuit closed his eyes and felt the weight settle fully onto his shoulders. He understood now. He was not an answer. He was an ending. and endings demanded choice. Somewhere between the sky and the silence, between dominance and consequence, the universe waited to see which definition of power would survive. Neither man moved, but the world leaned. Hard,